The streets of London had not yet shaken off their morning haze when the stillness of Whitehall was shattered by the shrill sirens of a foreign motorcade. It came roaring through Trafalgar Square, lights flashing, chrome engines gleaming, the stars and stripes fluttering proudly behind the dark SUV formation. Locals and tourists alike turned their heads, some in curiosity, some in annoyance. But one pair of ears picked up the noise differently. Atlas didn't flinch, he never did. Yet his left ear flicked slightly toward the direction of the approaching motorcade, and the big black Shire's eyes narrowed just a touch. He stood still as a statue beneath the gray London sky, the silver crest of the Household Cavalry glinting on his polished bridle, his chest rising and following with slow, deliberate rhythm. Atop him sat Trooper Walker, face expressionless beneath the plumed helmet, posture upright, hands firm on the reins. The two formed one body, one sentinel, planted in tradition, unmoving, imposing, watching. But the man in the back of the lead SUV wasn't one to be impressed by ceremony. Brigadier General Nathan Reed of the United States Army stepped out onto the damp cobblestones, his polished boots clicking as he adjusted the cap under his arm and took in the surroundings with a critical eye. He didn't care for parades. He had no patience for pageantry, and the idea of placing armed responsibility in the hooves of a horse and the hands of a boy in ceremonial armor, to him it bordered on theatrical negligence. "What the hell are we looking at?" Reed muttered, loud enough for his aide to hear. "Household Cavalry, sir," the aide replied, barely keeping pace. "The Queen's Life Guard. They've been stationed here since 1660. "Tourist trap, you mean?" Reed smirked. "Who guards a nation with ribbons and horses?" He stepped forward, ignoring the murmuring crowd nearby. His eyes locked on Walker, young, still, unreadable, and then on the massive creature beneath him, Atlas, 18 hands tall, with legs like marble columns and hooves the size of dinner plates. "Son," Reed called out, loud and deliberately casual, "do you even blink under all that armor?" Walker didn't answer. Reed chuckled, louder now for the onlookers. "I said, do you blink, or is that part of the act?" Still nothing. Then Reed raised his right hand and gave a sharp mock salute. "As you were, soldier." No response. Not even the horse shifted. The crowd began to stir, phones lifted, whispers spreading. A flicker of something moved across Reed's face. Was it irritation? Intrigue? He stepped closer. "Come on," he muttered. "You're not a robot. You're a kid with reins. Say something." The aide behind him gave a quiet warning. "Sir, protocol says we're not supposed to approach." But Reed was already stepping into the cordoned area, his boots crunching over the clean gravel as he walked straight up to the Shire. Atlas didn't move, but the pressure in the air changed. "You're a big boy," Reed muttered, circling toward the horse's side. "What do they feed you? Polished ego?" He reached out, palm open, not to pet, but to test, to challenge. Walker's voice finally came, low and sharp. "Sir, please step back." Reed grinned. "Ha! So you do talk." He kept moving, hand reaching toward the horse's bridle. "Sir?" In a heartbeat, Atlas's front hoof shifted, just a fraction, just enough for steel to bite gravel. The sound rang sharp, like the first strike of a war drum. The massive creature's chest bell gave a low clang that sent a subtle shiver through the crowd. Walker's right hand tightened, not on the reins, but across the pommel, elbow angled, still disciplined, still restrained. "Back," Walker said flatly. "Now." Reed's eyes met the soldiers. And for 1 second, just one, the general realized he wasn't looking at a boy in armor anymore. Atlas snorted, the sound like compressed thunder. He took half a step forward, not enough to charge, not enough to threaten, but enough to claim space. Reed stumbled back a pace. The crowd gasped. and behind them someone began clapping. It started slow, hesitant, then others joined in. A few cheers, a few laughs. Reed straightened, jaw clenched. "I see the act has some teeth," he muttered. Walker said nothing. Atlas raised his chin slightly, muscles under his neck flexing like cables. That moment hung in the air. The tourist crowd grew louder, excited now. Phones zoomed in. A pair of school kids pointed at the horse with wide eyes. Then a sharp whistle cut through the tension. A sergeant from the Household Cavalry's perimeter detail moved in fast, hand resting near his belt. "Sir, you're not authorized in that zone." Reed raised both hands in mock surrender and stepped back behind the line. Yeah, just taking a closer look at your royal mascots." The sergeant gave a stiff nod to Walker, who remained frozen in place. Atlas hadn't moved a muscle. The motorcade rumbled to life again behind them. As the vehicles rolled forward, Reed gave Walker one last look and then turned to his aide. "Set up a meeting," he said, "with whoever runs this circus. I want to know how they train that horse." And, without another word, he walked away, the sound of his boots swallowed by the returning roar of engines and the distant bells of Parliament. But behind him, in the heart of Whitehall, Atlas remained unmoved, unshaken, watching, waiting. The next morning came gray and cold, as if the skies above London had conspired to reflect the mood rising through the ranks at Knightsbridge Barracks. Word had already spread about the incident at Whitehall. A U.S. general stepping past the rope line, getting in the face of a lifeguard trooper, and nearly provoking one of the regiment's most formidable mounts. But it wasn't the tourists or the military police buzzing with speculation. It was Walker. He stood in silence in front of Atlas's stall, brushing down the Shire's thick mane with slow, even strokes. The stallion nickered once, sensing the stiffness in his rider's shoulders, but remained still. Discipline ran both ways. "He'll be back," came a voice from behind. Trooper Sims, older, already out of uniform, leaned against the wooden post with a mug of steaming tea in hand. Walker didn't look up. "He doesn't respect the boundary." "He doesn't respect the whole damn idea," Sims muttered. "American brass think we're show ponies in feathered helmets." Walker ran a hand across Atlas's flank. He touched the bridle. Sims exhaled, long and slow. "They'll probably put on some damage control today. Smile, nod, all that diplomacy rubbish." Walker gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Not Atlas. That same morning, the front gates of Whitehall creaked open again. Not to tourists or school groups, but to a carefully orchestrated reception. General Reed had requested an informal inspection of the ceremonial unit, and higher-ups, wary of diplomatic tension, had agreed to grant it. He arrived in a pressed olive-drab service uniform, medals gleaming, stride confident. But his eyes were sharp, scanning every formation, every weapon, every mount like a man searching for weakness. Walker was already mounted when Reed approached. The Shire's hooves were planted firmly into the gravel once more, his coat gleaming black and mirror-smooth in the winter light. The silver of his harness caught the faint sun that dared to break through the clouds. Walker held the reins as steady as the steel in his gaze. "Well," Reed said as he came to a halt, "there's the beast again." Walker didn't flinch. Reed smiled slightly and turned to the officer escorting him, a thin, fair-haired lieutenant. "You mind if I issue a command, Lieutenant?" The young officer hesitated. "It's not standard protocol, sir." "I'm not going to fire a cannon," Reed said with a chuckle. "I just want to see if your man here knows how to respond to authority." The lieutenant gave a half-hearted nod. "Proceed, General, within reason." Reed stepped directly in front of Walker and Atlas, planting his boots where only royalty and commanding officers ever dared to stand. He raised his right hand. "Trooper!" he barked. Walker's eyes didn't move. Atlas didn't blink. "I said, 'Trooper, by the authority of Allied command, you are ordered to salute.'" Silence. Reed's lips curled. "You deaf, boy?" Stillness. Atlas's chest expanded ever so slightly, drawing in the cold air like a slow-burning furnace. Reed's eyes darkened. Very well. He took a step forward and raised his arm, this time not in mock salute, but toward the stallion's bridle once more. The sound was subtle, a metallic chime as Atlas's chest bell rang from the shift of weight. His left hoof lifted just a half-inch, then landed with a sharp crack against the gravel. The noise silenced every voice nearby. Reed paused, hand still extended. "Are you going to move him, son, or do I have to?" Walker's voice came calm but firm. "Step back, sir." "Or what?" Reed said. "The horse gonna write me a ticket?" Walker didn't answer. His hand never moved. His breath didn't waver. Reed's jaw tightened. He reached for the reins. And then the air changed. It wasn't sudden or violent, but it was unmistakable. Atlas shifted his weight, neck rising, nostrils flaring just once. His ears pinned back. Not aggression, not yet, but an unmistakable warning. A line drawn in air and muscle. The horse's muscles rippled under his glossy coat. And from deep inside his throat, a low rumble sounded. Something ancient, more felt than heard. Reed's hand froze. Tourists nearby gasped. The lieutenant moved in a step. "Sir, I highly recommend." But Reed didn't move. He stared at the stallion, at the unmoving rider, and something inside him, pride, challenge, maybe even doubt, boiled to the surface. Then he did something no one expected. He grabbed the reins. It was only for a second, less than a second. But the moment his gloved hand closed around the polished leather, Atlas reacted. Not with violence, not with panic. He took one clean, controlled step backward. The move was precise, practiced, a perfect half-pace withdrawal. But it was enough. Enough to break the grip. Enough to make Reed stumble slightly off balance. Enough to make everyone watching go still. Walker's eyes flicked once toward the crowd, then back to Reed. "Don't touch what you don't understand, sir." Reed stared at him, for once speechless. Behind them, the sharp tweet of a military whistle echoed. From the edge of the plaza, a squad of red-tabbed personnel moved in, military police. An officer with a clipboard approached, eyes on Reed. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back." Reed gave a slow nod, dusted off his sleeve, and exhaled through his nose. He didn't argue, he didn't apologize, but he did look at Atlas differently. The crowd was murmuring now, not laughing, not clapping, just watching, waiting, like the horse. Walker sat in silence as the moment dissolved around them, and when Reed finally turned and walked away, Atlas gave a low snort. The chest bell rang again, clear, resonant, final. Before the chest bell ever rang, before the white plumes, the medals, the polished hooves that spark like iron against gravel, there was nothing but wind, mud, and endless green. Atlas wasn't born into ceremony. He wasn't bred for pageantry or the snapping of salutes. He was born on a rain-soaked farm just outside Ripon, Yorkshire, a stone's throw from nowhere, under a rusted tin roof that echoed with thunder in the spring. His dam, a quiet, sweet-natured bay named Elspeth, gave birth in the late hours of a stormy April night. The farmer, an old man with a crooked leg and tobacco-stained fingers, had delivered dozens of foals in his lifetime. But when he saw the size of this one, he let out a long whistle. "God help us," he muttered, brushing the wet from the colt's flank. "You'll crush the world under those hooves." They named him Tank. Nothing noble, nothing poetic, just Tank, the way you might name a tractor or a stubborn bull that broke through gates. But even as a foal, there was something in his eyes, something still. Tank didn't buck like the others. He didn't race the wind or jostle for position in the herd. He watched, he learned, and when the other foals came tumbling through the grass, biting at each other's ears, Tank held his ground, legs planted, head low. By the time he was 2, he towered over the others. By the time he was 3, he moved like a shadow over hills. And by 4, the recruiters came. The British Army had been quietly seeking fresh shires to replenish their cavalry ranks, not for combat, but for honor, for tradition, for strength that didn't flinch beneath the weight of steel and order. The officer who visited the Yorkshire farm had seen dozens of candidates that month, most too skittish, too headstrong, too soft-eyed. But when Tank turned his massive head at the sound of the officer's boots and didn't move, didn't blink, the man smiled. "This one," he said, "he looks like he's seen war." So Tank became Atlas. He was loaded onto a long trailer, driven 6 hours south, and unloaded into the training stables at Windsor. There was no fanfare. The first thing he learned wasn't how to march or pose or prance for tourists. It was how to stand, still, unmoving, unshaken. It was harder than it sounded. Horses are creatures of motion. Fight or flight lives in their blood. But Atlas was different. When the instructor fired the blank round 3 meters from his flank, he didn't bolt. His ears twitched, but his hooves didn't move. The instructor nodded. He's a slow burn, not a flincher. They tested him harder. Firecrackers near his tail, umbrellas in his face, even a dropped saber clattering just inches from his chest. Atlas didn't spook. But discipline wasn't enough. He had to learn obedience, command, stillness under tension. They paired him with a retired mount named George, a graying warhorse with battle scars behind his left knee and the wisdom of age in every step. George taught him how to listen, not just to the reins, but to the silence between commands. How to rest while standing. How to hold a pose for hours in the rain, eyes forward, muscles locked, even as the world blurred past in double-decker buses and drunken chants on Parliament nights. The hardest part came in the winter drills. Estonia, 2023. The cavalry had sent a select team for deep freeze training with NATO partners, testing both rider and mount under sub-zero stress. The frost was unrelenting. The wind sliced through the fur-lined blankets like knives. But Atlas didn't break. During one drill, artillery shells, simulated but loud, pounded the snowfields in staggered bursts. The younger horses reared. One even slipped and bolted. But Atlas stood beside his rider, Walker, not moving an inch. Walker dismounted once, frost clinging to his chin, and pressed his forehead to the Shire's warm flank. "You're not just a horse," he whispered. "You're a wall." From that point forward, their bond was sealed. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't full of whispered secrets or soft brushes under moonlight. It was forged through repetition, sweat, cold, hours of grooming, saddling, marching, and re-marching. 1,000 touch points, 1,000 commands. When Walker got promoted to mounted duty at Whitehall, he requested one partner, Atlas. His officer raised an eyebrow. "You want the beast?" Walker nodded. "He listens." And so they returned to London. One man, one horse, no longer recruits, but standards. In the mirror-polished halls of the Household Cavalry stables, Atlas became more than muscle and discipline. He became a signal, a boundary, a living line between tradition and chaos, form and disrespect. And the tourists never knew. They only saw the shine, the size, the stoicism. They didn't know that when fireworks lit up the sky on New Year's Eve, Atlas didn't flinch. They didn't see the drills in darkness, the waterlogged saddles, the blood blisters on Walker's palms from reins gripped too long in the cold. They didn't hear the conversations, rare, quiet, between rider and horse during lonely winter dawns before the city woke. "Hold the line," Walker would murmur, and Atlas would, always. So, when the American general reached for the bridle, when the rope line was crossed, when the order was challenged, Atlas didn't react like a beast. He remembered, he calculated, he held. And when the bell rang from his chest, it wasn't just a sound. It was history, ringing through 350 years of blood, spit, and steel. The sun hadn't yet climbed over the rooftops of West London when Walker slipped out of his bunk. The barracks hallway was still and dim, lit only by the occasional flicker of overhead bulbs, and the faint sound of boots on polished tile echoed through the corridor like a heartbeat. He moved by instinct, not thought. Muscle memory, repetition, timing. Everything in his morning routine had been drilled into him until it became part of his bloodstream. Wake at 5. Wash at 5:03. Boots laced and jacket buttoned at 5:15. No wasted seconds. No hesitation. He moved like a soldier not just on duty, but in the quiet hours when no one was watching. Outside, the January air bit at his skin the moment he pushed through the stable doors. The scent of hay, oiled leather, and cold iron filled his lungs. Familiar, grounding. Atlas turned his head the moment Walker entered. "Morning," Walker murmured, rubbing a gloved hand over the Shire's broad forehead. "You sleep?" The horse snorted once, as if to say, "Better than you did." Walker smiled, tired. He hadn't slept much since the encounter with General Reed, not out of fear, but frustration. He didn't care about foreign brass and their opinions, but what chafed him was the ignorance, the casual disdain that danced too close to disrespect. He reached for the brush and began the slow, methodical grooming process. Every stroke had purpose, not just to clean, but to connect. It was part inspection, part meditation. His hand slid along the horse's neck, feeling for tension, for raised heat or missed burrs. "You held better than I did," he muttered, brushing down Atlas's flank. The Shire shifted his weight, settling into the ritual. By 5:45, the curry comb had done its job, and the brushing gave way to saddling. Walker moved with precision. First the saddle pad, then the heavy leather saddle, cinched and smoothed with practiced palms. He polished the bit with a cloth before slipping it gently into Atlas's mouth, adjusting the bridle straps without tugging. Then came the girth, a final check, tight enough for control, loose enough for comfort. His fingers ran over every buckle, every loop, making sure nothing would chafe, snap, or twist under pressure. As he worked, the stable around him began to stir. Other troopers filed in, yawning, grumbling, nodding silent greetings. But even among them, Walker stood apart. Not because he was taller or stricter or meaner, but because his silence was earned. He didn't talk much, didn't joke, but when he spoke, people listened. At 6:10, he stepped back to admire his work. Atlas gleamed, a walking monument of discipline. His coat shone like obsidian, his hooves scrubbed and oiled, his silver-plated tack without a smudge. But it wasn't vanity, it was respect. For the job, for the uniform, for the beast that bore both man and meaning on its back. Walker straightened the chest bell, then tapped it gently with 2 knuckles. The chime was crisp, balanced. Perfect. "Mounting up in 10, barked a sergeant from down the aisle. Walker gave Atlas a final pat, then swung himself into the saddle in one smooth motion. They were out of the stables and into the courtyard by 6:20, hooves clapping quietly on the cobblestones. The frost hadn't yet melted, and their breath came in twin clouds, horse and man, silent sentinels emerging from shadow. As the formation assembled, Walker took his position at the right flank, his eyes scanning the line for imperfections. A crooked strap here, an uneven stirrup there, but overall it was solid. The regiment commander approached, giving curt nods as he passed each trooper. When he reached Walker, he paused. "You're ready for this morning's rerun?" the commander asked, eyes narrowed. Walker didn't blink. "Always, sir." "Good. Word is the general's pushing for an official review. Might be guests." Walker nodded once. Understood. The commander gave a tight smile and moved on. At 6:30, the gates opened. The procession began its slow march toward Whitehall, clopping hooves and rattling sabers echoing against brick and glass as London yawned itself awake. Walker kept his eyes forward, posture rigid, hands steady. He didn't think about Reed. He thought about Estonia. The snow, the sound of shell fire, the stillness of Atlas beneath him as simulated chaos exploded around them. The way his heart had thudded in his throat, and the only thing keeping it from spilling out was the solid mass of the horse beneath him. He thought about the first time he'd mounted Atlas, how the stallion had accepted him without resistance, like he'd been waiting for this particular rider all along. And he thought about the conversation with Sergeant Ellers last month during night guard. "You ever worry it's all just for show?" Ellers had asked, his voice thick with weariness. "No," Walker had answered without hesitation. Ellers had chuckled. "You would say that." But Walker had looked at him then, really looked, and said, "Show keeps the cracks from widening. Ceremony holds the line when politics fail. That's not decoration, that's duty." The memory vanished as the troopers rounded the final corner, entering the wide stretch of Whitehall. The city was brighter now. The motorcade barriers were gone. But in the minds of the troopers, the boundary remained. As they came to a halt, Atlas shifted once, then froze. Walker's breath stilled in his chest. Across the square, a man in army green stood watching. Reed. Not flanked by aides this time, not talking, just standing, arms crossed, watching the procession come to rest. Walker kept his eyes forward. He didn't acknowledge him. But the moment settled between them like fog. The bell at Atlas's chest rang out once as they came to full attention. The city hushed. And in that quiet, Walker whispered under his breath, barely audible to anyone but the horse beneath him, "Let him come." The morning light sharpened into thin silver blades slicing across the facades of Whitehall. The guard had been posted for 43 minutes. Most tourists had moved on to cafes or museums, but a core crowd still lingered behind the rope lines, waiting for something to break the silence. A twitch, a glance, a single shift from the mounted soldiers who held their ground like monuments. Atlas didn't move, neither did Walker. They'd trained for this, to outwait time itself. But they weren't the only ones waiting. On the far side of the courtyard, General Reed stood near a black BMW, arms folded across his chest, shoulders rigid with restrained defiance. He'd been watching the entire time, quiet, calculating. Now, without a word, he began walking forward. It started slowly, almost casually, a man with authority inspecting a foreign practice. A few in the crowd turned their heads. A few lifted their phones. One tourist whispered, "Is he allowed to do that?" Walker saw him immediately. Reed stepped under the rope line. No hesitation, no clearance. Just one heavy-booted step after another, straight into the protected ceremonial space. Walker didn't move. Atlas didn't move. The sergeant posted near the perimeter hesitated, then stepped forward, raising a hand. "Sir, please return behind the rope." Reed brushed him off without slowing. "I've got clearance." "You don't," the sergeant snapped, voice louder now. But Reed was already 10 paces away. He stopped just short of Atlas's shoulder. The stallion was still, his ears pinned slightly back. His nostrils flared once, then settled. Walker's voice came sharp but calm. "You're out of bounds, sir." Reed turned his head slowly, meeting Walker's eyes. "This horse," he said flatly, "is more protected than a diplomatic convoy." Walker didn't respond. Reed turned back to Atlas. He took one slow step forward. "You're a good actor, I'll give you that," he muttered. "You know how many parades I've walked behind in Washington? Every single one has a horse like you. Big, loud, empty." He raised his hand. Walker didn't speak this time. Atlas shifted his weight. It was slight, just enough to cause the silver-plated stirrup to creak. Reed's hand hovered near the horse's mane. The crowd was now silent, phones lifted, fingers frozen above screens. And then he did it. He touched the horse. His fingers grazed Atlas's thick, midnight black mane, slow and deliberate. It was like pressing a trigger. Atlas's head lifted, ears snapping forward, muscles rippling beneath the saddle. His front right hoof struck forward, not to kick, not to attack, but to plant, claiming ground with a deep clang that rang like a hammer on steel. Reed flinched. The crowd gasped. Walker moved. It wasn't much, just a flick of the wrist, a tightening of the reins, but it sent a message. Atlas backed one step, then pivoted with a precision turn, placing himself directly between Reed and the rest of the formation. Now the horse was facing Reed, chest bell swaying, the silver pendant glinting like a warning light. Reed's expression hardened. He took another step forward. "Sir," Walker's voice cracked like a shot. "He's just a horse," Reed snapped. "He's a weapon," Walker replied, eyes locked on Reed's. From the corner of the square, a police whistle shrieked. Two military police officers sprinted toward the scene. The crowd parted. Reed stood his ground. Atlas stood his. But it wasn't over. The tension hung like a drawn bowstring, stretched, shaking, moments from release. Walker leaned forward slightly in the saddle, his voice lower now. "Atlas, hold." The Shire froze again. The MPs arrived seconds later, flanking Reed. "General, step away now," one of them barked. Reed hesitated. Then he looked up. At Walker, at Atlas, at the still formation behind them. The crowd was staring. No one cheered, no one laughed. The mood had shifted. This was no longer theater. Reed raised both hands and took one step back. "Fine." The MPs held position until he returned behind the rope. Only then did Walker ease the reins, allowing Atlas to relax his neck. The chest bell rang once more, clear, controlled. Order re-established. But the damage was done. The rope line wasn't just symbolic anymore. It had become a live boundary, one tested, one defended. As the MPs began clearing the front perimeter and asking the crowd to lower their devices, a staff sergeant strode toward Walker from the side gate. He whispered something up to the rider, who nodded once, tight-lipped. Then Walker turned Atlas on a pivot and rode through the archway toward the inner barracks. The shift had been triggered. Later that hour, a quiet conference was called inside the Knightsbridge officers' quarters. Captain Olivia Collins was among the first to arrive. She tapped her fingers against the desk, reviewing the incident report filed by the MPs and already cross-referenced with the ceremonial officers' notes. She didn't sigh, didn't frown. She simply read. And when her aide stepped in and whispered, "The general is asking to meet," again, she gave one curt nod. "Then let's remind him," she said, rising, "why we guard with steel instead of words." Captain Olivia Collins didn't believe in wasted movement. She walked like a woman whose spine had been forged in ritual and sanded down by years of standing orders. Her uniform was crisp, her dark hair neatly coiled under the regulation beret, her stride cutting clean lines through the marbled corridors of Knightsbridge Barracks. By the time she stepped into the meeting room, General Reed was already there, arms folded, jaw set, shoulders angled toward confrontation like a boxer before the bell. Collins didn't bother with small talk. She closed the door behind her and placed a thin folder on the polished table between them. "General Reed," she said with clipped clarity, "this meeting is not disciplinary, it's explanatory, for your benefit." Reed raised an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling it now? Collins didn't flinch. You overstepped ceremonial boundaries this morning, again. My command requested that I clarify the implications before further incidents occur. Reed leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the sparse decor of the room. No ornaments, no flags, no comfort. Just a wall-mounted photograph of the Queen's lifeguard in formation, and a brass clock ticking down time with surgical precision. "I'm not here to play dress-up, Captain," he said. "I'm here to assess joint readiness. And frankly, what I've seen so far looks like a pageant, not a fighting force." Collins nodded once, as if she'd expected nothing less. "That assumption," she said calmly, "is precisely why you're sitting in that chair." She flipped open the folder and slid a printed sheet across the table. It was an excerpt from Standing Order 157, a centuries-old regulation that established the authority and function of the Household Cavalry during ceremonial and heightened security states. "In times of both peace and civil unrest," Collins recited, "the lifeguard is not merely symbolic. Our jurisdiction includes control of royal grounds, enforcement of restricted access, and immediate tactical response under defined protocols." Reed didn't touch the paper. "You're quoting doctrine." "I'm quoting precedent," Collins replied. "You're hiding behind theater," he shot back. "What good is a mounted soldier in a drone war? You think a parade horse intimidates an insurgent with a Kalashnikov?" Collins held his gaze, unmoved. "You're missing the point, General. This isn't about intimidation. It's about presence, perception, the reinforcement of stability through precision and control. Atlas didn't strike you, he measured you, and he chose restraint." Reed scoffed. "That's rich. You're assigning moral calculus to an animal." "I'm assigning consequence," Collins countered. "A soldier who touches an armed partner without authorization would be reprimanded. Why should it be different because the partner has 4 legs and weighs 1,000 kilos? Reed sat forward now. "Let's say your little stunt this morning backfires. Let's say that horse spooks, kicks, causes a scene. What then? You think your discipline saves you from liability?" "We don't train for lawsuits," Collins said. "We train for control. And I trust my riders and my horses more than I trust men who think muscle equals mastery." For a moment, silence bloomed. Then Collins leaned slightly forward, voice lower, colder. "You think power is loud, General, but the most dangerous weapon in this regiment doesn't make a sound." Reed's eyes narrowed. "You're proud of that line, huh?" "I didn't write it. I learned it. In Estonia, under blackout drills, where Trooper Walker stood frozen for 6 hours beside a roaring gun line, while your so-called battle-ready Marines rotated out every 40 minutes due to stress fatigue." She let it hang. Reed didn't reply right away. He shifted slightly in his seat. "Then show me," he finally said. "Show me how a horse and a boy in ceremonial brass outlasts trained men with field gear and rifles. Show me this discipline you all worship like gospel." Collins nodded once, slowly. "I thought you'd never ask." That afternoon, Collins personally escorted Reed through the rear gates of Hyde Park Barracks. No cameras, no press, no tourists leaning over rope lines. Just the distant echo of hooves, the smell of cordite, and the hard-packed training yard scarred by decades of drills. Atlas was already saddled, the sheen of sweat across his coat catching the low light. Walker stood beside him, helmet tucked under one arm, calm as always. "You'll observe a live training sequence," Collins said to Reed as they entered the enclosure. "No interruptions, no commands, just your eyes and your judgment." Reed folded his arms. The signal was given. Atlas moved first, hauling a ceremonial cannon across the field, hooves digging into gravel with thunderous grace. Then came the first fire command, a blank artillery shell exploding with a deafening crack. White smoke surged into the sky. The smell of powder lingered like lightning in the air. Walker didn't flinch. Atlas didn't blink. The second cannon fired, this time closer. Stillness. Collins leaned slightly toward Reed. Every second that horse doesn't react is a second a rider can aim, reload, survive. Next, the carbines were drawn. 4 troopers galloped in formation, their rifles raised. Shots rang out, blanks but loud enough to shake dust from the rafters. One mount faltered. Another snorted, sidestepping. Atlas held course. Walker's aim was steady as a ruler. When the last round fired, the silence returned. Reed was quiet now, not because he was convinced, but because for the first time since he arrived, he didn't have a counterpunch ready. Collins turned to him. "You wanted proof. There it is." Reed squinted across the field. Atlas was still standing, chest rising, eyes clear. And somehow, impossibly, he looked bigger now. Reed exhaled slowly. "I'll admit," he muttered, "it's more than I expected." Collins nodded. "And still less than you understand." Rain spat lightly against the stone courtyard as General Reed stood just inside the iron gates of the Hyde Park Barracks training grounds. The clouds were low, gray as steel, and the wind carried the burnt scent of gunpowder from the earlier cannon blasts. He hadn't spoken since the last round fired, and, for the first time since his arrival in London, he looked less like a general and more like a man re-evaluating the weight of things he couldn't quite explain. Captain Collins gave no comfort. She simply gestured to the edge of the open field where Trooper Walker waited, fully mounted again atop Atlas, whose flanks still shimmered with sweat, though his eyes remained calm. "This isn't over, sir," she said. "Now you'll observe live carbine drills. Close quarters, variable noise, no verbal commands. The riders will operate entirely through pressure, posture, and leg cues." Reed frowned. "No reins?" "Minimal," she said. "In the event a rider loses hand function during combat, the mount must still perform under weight, direction, and chaos." He scoffed, but more gently this time. "You're talking about horses as autonomous units." Collins didn't smile. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." A whistle blew across the parade ground. Walker shifted in the saddle. Atlas stepped forward. Then the world changed. From hidden canisters planted around the field, clouds of white smoke erupted in loud hisses, spilling across the gravel and grass like battlefield fog. Red strobes flashed through the haze, mimicking gunfire. Loudspeaker systems scattered across the perimeter began projecting the rapid-fire crack of simulated rifles, mixed with disorienting echo bursts and overlapping commands shouted in multiple languages. The effect was immediate and unnerving. Reed blinked and instinctively took a step back. Out of the smoke, Atlas charged. But he didn't bolt. He advanced in formation, shoulder to shoulder with 3 other cavalry mounts, each bearing a rider in full tactical gear, helmets down, carbines slung across their chests. They didn't yell, they didn't flinch. Reed watched in disbelief as Walker raised his rifle with one hand, the other never touching the reins. Atlas didn't need instruction. He pivoted on cue, maintaining formation even as synthetic gunfire popped from his right side. Suddenly, one of the other horses broke formation, a younger mount, skittish, spooked by a flash of red light. The rider managed to pull him back, but the gap had opened. Without hesitation, Atlas shifted to the left, filling the breach. "Did you see that?" Reed muttered. Collins nodded. He corrected the line without being told. "That's impossible. That's training. Pressure on the flanks, pulse cues from Walker's knees, balance discipline. They're not reacting to panic, they're responding to code." More flashes, another burst of sound. One rider dismounted and engaged in a simulated wounded trooper extraction. The horse stood motionless beside him, hooves planted, even as the loudspeakers screamed a recorded explosion. Then came the command, "Cease drill." The smoke stopped hissing, the light died. Silence returned like a curtain falling on a stage. Walker eased Atlas into a walk and circled back toward the observation line. Reed stepped forward before Collins could say anything. When the stallion came to a halt in front of him, Reed didn't speak for a moment. He looked up at the horse. The black sheen of its coat damp with effort, the glint of white powder on its shoulder, the controlled rise and fall of its breath. Its chest bell swayed slightly, not from chaos, but from rhythm. How close was that simulation to real battle noise? Reed finally asked. Walker answered without emotion. Close enough for the horse to separate signal from panic. Reed turned to Collins. How often do they run that drill? Weekly, in full gear, rain or shine. He looked back at Atlas, then up at Walker. How do you get a horse to move like that, to think like that? Walker answered simply, you don't force it, you build it. Over how long? Walker looked down at him, then offered the barest nod. Years. Reed stepped closer, now just an arm's length from the stallion. This time, he didn't reach out. Instead, he looked the animal in the eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that didn't blink under fire, that didn't bolt at sound or smoke or light. You really didn't flinch, did you? Atlas stared back, motionless. And something in Reed cracked. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible to anyone but maybe himself. But for the first time in years, maybe decades, he recognized control without domination, power without volume, strength without aggression. He stepped back and folded his arms, but softer now. I was wrong, he muttered. This isn't theater. Collins nodded slowly. It never was. Reed looked at her. What now? We have one more exercise, she said. It's not tactical, it's personal. Walker dismounted. The crunch of his boots on the gravel broke the quiet. He removed his helmet and walked Atlas back toward the stables. Collins turned to Reed. After rest, the horse will stand again. Not in the field, not in smoke, but here. You'll approach him. Reed raised a brow. You want me to touch the horse again? No, I want you to earn his stillness. The general frowned. What does that mean? She answered as she turned away. When the siren wails, you'll understand. The sun had dipped low by the time General Reed found himself once again inside the Hyde Park barracks. The drill yard was quieter now. The smoke from the earlier exercises long cleared, the ground damp with evening dew. Only a few troopers lingered along the fence line, silent sentinels who knew better than to interrupt what was about to happen. At the center of the gravel square stood Atlas. No saddle, no bridle, no armor or medals or regalia. Just the black Shire horse, still and upright, eyes focused ahead, muscles calm beneath his skin like the surface of a dark lake. Trooper Walker stood nearby, helmet tucked under his arm, jacket folded over a rail. Captain Collins approached Reed with deliberate steps, stopping just beside him. He's been standing there for 20 minutes, she said, voice low. No restraints, no distractions, just posture and breath. Reed nodded, eyes locked on the horse. What exactly is this test? Collins turned her gaze toward the signal tower on the barracks wall. In 60 seconds, the alert siren will sound. A standard battlefield signal, loud, disorienting, the same one we use in artillery range breach drills. Reed's jaw tightened slightly. And my role? I'll walk out there, she said calmly, step by step, when the siren starts. No talking, no sudden movements, just walk. Reed frowned. Toward him? Toward his face, she clarified. And when you're close enough, raise your hand, open, slow, and place it on his forehead. Reed stared at her. You want me to touch him while that alarm is going? Collins nodded. If he lets you. If he doesn't, you stop. He took a breath. What's the point? To see who breaks first. She walked away. Walker remained silent. He didn't offer a nod of encouragement, nor a warning. Just a neutral gaze, as though this moment belonged entirely to Reed and the horse. The red beacon on the tower began to pulse. Reed inhaled sharply. Then the siren blared. It wasn't a soft wail. It was harsh, a multi-tone military alert that ripped through the evening quiet like a blade. The sound echoed off brick and stone, rebounding through the yard, rattling in the chest, sharp enough to jolt the nerves. Atlas didn't move. Reed swallowed and stepped forward. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, sharp and uneven. Each step felt exposed, slow, absurdly loud under the screaming siren. He resisted the urge to cover his ears. He resisted the voice in his mind that told him to stop, to retreat, to wait until it was over. Atlas stood perfectly still. 10 feet away now. Reed could see the soft ripple of breath through the stallion's nostrils, could feel the weight of his own heartbeat rising up his neck. The noise clawed at the edges of his concentration. He took another step, and another. Atlas's eyes flicked toward him. No fear, no tension, only awareness. Reed was close enough now to see the dark shimmer of sweat that had dried under the horse's eyes, remnants of the earlier drills. He hesitated. The siren shrieked louder, peaking. And then he did it. Reed slowly raised his right hand, fingers spread, palm open. He moved like he was underwater, deliberate, unthreatening. His arm trembled slightly, not from fear of the horse, but from the weight of everything behind this moment. His misjudgment, his ego, his ignorance. 6 inches from contact. Atlas didn't blink. 3 inches. Reed's breath caught. 1 inch. And then contact. His palm met the center of Atlas's forehead. Heat, stillness, power, all resting just beneath the surface. The siren kept wailing, but for a brief moment, it was like neither of them heard it. Atlas didn't move. Reed closed his eyes, just for a second. His hand rested there, not controlling, not testing, just resting. Then the siren stopped. Abrupt silence collapsed over the courtyard like a wave. Reed opened his eyes. Atlas blinked once, just once. The general let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and slowly he lowered his hand. He stepped back, 2 paces, then 3. Atlas remained where he was, immobile, unshaken, silent. Reed turned to find Captain Collins and Walker standing just inside the shadow of the archway. Neither applauded, neither smiled, but there was something in their posture, a subtle loosening, a quiet acknowledgement. He walked back toward them. When he reached Walker, he paused. "He didn't move," Reed said. Walker nodded. That was the test. Collins stepped forward, hands clasped behind her back. "You wanted to understand discipline," she said. "Now you felt it." Reed looked back over his shoulder at the massive horse, still standing as if carved from stone. "You train him not to react, not even when the body says run." "We don't train him to ignore instinct," Walker said quietly. "We train him to choose command over fear." Reed's gaze dropped. His voice dropped lower with it. "That's not just discipline. That's trust." Collins's tone softened. "Exactly." They stood in silence for a moment longer before Reed cleared his throat. He looked at Walker. "I misjudged you," he said simply, "and him." Walker gave the faintest nod. "You're not the first." Reed turned again to Atlas. And for the first time, not as a soldier, not as a guest, but as a man, he gave a proper salute, slow, respectful, silent. Atlas didn't move, but somehow it felt like the entire barracks did. Somewhere beyond the last salute, beyond the final hoofbeat echoing off Hyde Park Barracks, a different kind of silence settled in, not the silence of absence, but of understanding. It was the quiet that comes after tension has stretched its full length and then, finally, lets go. General Reed didn't speak much on the walk back. He didn't need to. Something in the square-shaped hardness of his posture had softened, subtly but undeniably. His boots, once loud with assertion, now struck the ground with the weight of something heavier, respect. It was Captain Collins who finally broke the silence. "Most people think tradition is about memory," she said, walking beside him under the dimming sky. "But in the military, it's about muscle. Muscle and nerve." Reed turned his head slightly. "Muscle, I get, but nerve?" Collins nodded toward the parade field, where a fresh squad of troopers had begun evening drills, lining up, facing forward, locking into place without a word of instruction. "We train our soldiers to stand in the rain for 6 hours straight," she said, in silence, with sabers at their sides and people shouting inches from their ears. "Not because the Queen demands it, but because the battlefield will." Reed watched as one of the younger troopers adjusted his stance after a quiet tap from a superior. Not a scolding, just a reminder. "The mind gives out before the body ever does," Collins continued. "But if you train the nerves, if you teach a soldier how to hold ground under pressure, how to choose stillness over reflex, you've built more than posture. You've built clarity under fire." They paused at the far edge of the field, just beneath a bronze plaque mounted on the barracks wall. Reed glanced at it. The engraving was simple. "Stand fast, move only with purpose." He looked back at Collins. "I used to think ceremonial units were a distraction, all polish, no punch." "That's the point," she said. "You're not supposed to see the punch. You're supposed to see the stillness and ask what's behind it." She reached into her coat pocket and handed him a folded report. It was short, 2 pages, printed on clean Ministry of Defense letterhead. At the top, it read, "Cavalry Resilience Metrics, Psychological Stress Thresholds." Reed scanned the summary. Household cavalry troopers, after 24 weeks of ceremonial duty rotation, demonstrate 32% higher threshold for auditory startle response, 41% slower onset of adrenaline-triggered tremors, 29% increase in measured pulse control during live-fire simulations. They stand longer, think slower, fire steadier, Collins said. Not despite standing still all day, but because of it. Reed's eyes lingered on the final bullet point. Significant increase in post-deployment mental resilience, with a 25% decrease in reported symptoms of combat-induced anxiety after ceremonial assignment. He closed the file. "You're telling me all this, tradition, actually rewires them?" "Not rewires," she said, "fortifies." He looked up at the dusk-washed sky, then back toward the courtyard, where Walker was leading Atlas into his stable for the night. The horse moved with no reins, no voice commands, just rhythm, memory, trust. "You don't think that breaks them down?" Reed asked. "Hours of silence, posture, repetition?" "It only breaks the ones who don't want to be built," she said. He exhaled slowly. "Back home, we talk about mental toughness like it's something you shout into a mirror." Collins smirked, just faintly. "Here, we talk about it with our backs straight and our mouths shut." Reed nodded. "There's a lesson in that." She turned to him fully now. "You came here asking what a horse and a parade have to do with modern war. You saw a statue, you saw a pose. But that stillness is what keeps a man from panicking when the firefight starts. It's what makes a soldier breathe before pulling the trigger. It's not for show. It's a shield." Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I believe you." "Good," she said, "because our horses don't salute, but they remember who does." That night, Reed sat alone in the visiting officers' quarters. No aide. No noise, just a kettle of tea cooling beside a folder of reports he no longer needed to read. He thought about the siren, about the feel of Atlas's warm skin under his palm, about standing inches away from one of the largest land animals on Earth under pressure, and realizing he was the one who had to stay calm, not the horse. He poured the tea, watched the steam rise and curl. In the end, it wasn't the weight of Atlas's body that impressed him. It was the weight the horse chose not to throw, the force he held back, the instinct he reined in. That was power. That was nerve. The next morning arrived without spectacle. No sirens, no cannon drills, no smoke or simulation. Just the pale London sky stretched over Whitehall, the streets glistening from an early shower. Tourists gathered behind the familiar rope line once more, cameras in hand, expecting routine. The Household Cavalry stood in full dress, statues in motionless formation, steel glinting off their breastplates, plumes rising stiff in the breeze. Trooper Walker sat tall in the saddle. Atlas beneath him was silent and still, head high, body unmoving, the picture of authority in harness and flesh. At exactly 11 a.m., the changing of the guard began. It was a ritual as old as the stones beneath their hooves. Horses moved in seamless formation, sabers gleamed, boots struck gravel in rhythm. It was the kind of performance so precise it often seemed invisible to those who watched. But not today. Because today, General Nathan Reed stood behind the rope line. No aides, no commentary, no clipboard or rank insignia. Just a man in a simple coat, hat in hand, eyes focused forward. A woman standing nearby turned to him and whispered, "Excuse me, are you someone important?" Reed shook his head slowly. Not today. The formation turned, Atlas now squarely facing the crowd, his black mane rippling slightly in the wind. Walker didn't glance toward Reed. He didn't need to. Because Reed stepped forward. Not across the rope, not into restricted space, just to the very edge. And then, without announcement or cue, he did something no one had seen an American general do in that square. He stood at attention, faced the trooper and his mount, and raised his right hand in a full military salute. The crowd went quiet. Phones lowered. No one instructed them to stop. They simply did. And then, in perfect silence, Walker returned the salute. But not with his hand. He simply nodded. A slow, deliberate dip of the helmet. And Atlas, as if sensing the weight of that moment, exhaled sharply, the soft thrum from his nostrils rising like smoke into the morning chill. The bell on his chest rang out with the cleanest, most crystalline chime yet. It cut through the silence like a thread through fabric, not loud, but exact, final, whole. Then the formation turned again, the parade continued, and the guard changed hands. Reed didn't linger. He didn't wave. He placed his hat back on and disappeared into the crowd. But those who witnessed it, even if they didn't understand what they had seen, knew something rare had happened. A break in the script that didn't shatter the order, but gave it meaning. Back at the barracks, hours later, Captain Collins reviewed the morning log. A knock came at her door. It was Walker. She looked up. He did it? Walker gave a single nod. He saluted first. Collins leaned back in her chair. Good. Walker turned to go, then paused. He was shaking a little. She raised an eyebrow. The general? Walker nodded again, but he held it. Collins didn't smile, but her voice softened. That's what matters. In the stables, Atlas was being groomed. His coat brushed to a soft sheen, his chest bell polished once more. A stable hand worked quietly, humming under his breath. The horse stood still, even without command, as always. But every now and then, his ear flicked toward the open stable door, as if still listening, as if expecting someone to come back and try again. Because the lesson Atlas carried wasn't about ceremony, it was about presence, about who shows up and who stands still when they do. Later that week, the Ministry of Defense published an internal memo. It read, "The incident involving General Reed and the Household Cavalry has been resolved with full mutual respect. The General has acknowledged the operational integrity of ceremonial units and requested a permanent liaison post between his office and the Household Cavalry Training Command. He expressed interest in incorporating elements of nerve control and mounted formation into Allied readiness programs for personnel deployed in high-pressure environments. He has also voluntarily returned for a second session, unannounced, simply to observe." Back in Whitehall, the horses stand as they always have, still, immovable, listening. Not because they're told to, but because someone, somewhere, once taught them that strength is what you choose not to do, that power is the patience to wait, that discipline is the silent force that never raises its voice because it doesn't have to. And when men like Reed cross rope lines, not to challenge, but to understand, that's when the steel stops being a symbol and becomes the shield. When understanding replaces doubt, when discipline answers pride, and when tradition proves itself in stillness, then rank becomes irrelevant and respect becomes everything. When we learn to see the silence, we begin to hear the truth.